Picture this: a world where frost clings to summer leaves, where rivers turn to ice in what should be the warmest months, and where the sun seems to hide behind a perpetual grey veil. This wasn't the setting of some dystopian tale, but the everyday reality for millions across medieval Europe during the Little Ice Age. From the 14th to the 19th century, temperatures plummeted, harvests withered, and survival became a daily battle against the elements. But here's what's truly astonishing. Amid the chaos, ordinary people didn't just endure, they adapted, innovated, and carved out lives against impossible odds. Their stories, buried beneath centuries of history, hold secrets of resilience that feel eerily relevant today as we face our own climate uncertainties. Think about the last time you felt the bite of an unusually cold winter or watched news of erratic weather patterns disrupting lives somewhere in the world. Now multiply that by decades with no modern technology to soften the blow. That's the scale of what medieval communities faced. Villages vanished under snowdrifts, trade routes collapsed, and famine became a shadow that never quite lifted. Yet, in the face of such hardship, humanity's ingenuity shone brightest. Farmers experimented with hardier crops, families repurposed every scrap of food, and entire communities rallied together in ways that would redefine survival itself. These weren't just acts of desperation, they were strokes of brilliance born from necessity, lessons etched into the very fabric of history. So why does this matter to us now? Because the echoes of the Little Ice Age are more than just historical footnotes. They're a mirror held up to our own era, a reminder of how fragile our systems can be when nature shifts the rules. But they're also a testament to the unyielding spirit of ordinary people, not so different from you and me. Over the course of this journey, we'll uncover how medieval Europeans turned crisis into opportunity, how they forged warmth from the cold, and how their legacy of resilience might just hold the key to navigating our own uncertain future. This isn't just a story about the past. It's a survival guide for the human spirit, waiting to be rediscovered. The Little Ice Age didn't announce itself with a single catastrophic event, no sudden freeze, no overnight famine. Instead, it crept in like a slow, uninvited guest, settling over Europe decade by decade until its presence became impossible to ignore. By the 14th century, summers grew shorter and cooler, winters harsher and longer. Glaciers, once confined to mountain peaks, began their relentless advance, swallowing villages whole. Rivers that had never frozen in living memory, like the Thames in England, became seasonal highways of ice, with frost fairs erupting on their surfaces. But beneath this eerie beauty lay a grim reality. The land itself was turning against the people who depended on it. What made this period so devastating was its sheer persistence. Imagine year after year of failed harvests, where wheat and barley withered in fields that once yielded abundance. Vineyards in southern England, which had flourished during the warmer medieval warm period, now struggled to produce even sour grapes. In Scandinavia, sea ice choked harbors for months, cutting off fishing communities from their lifeblood. This wasn't just bad weather, it was a fundamental rewiring of the natural systems that sustained civilization. And while scientists today point to factors like volcanic eruptions blocking sunlight or changes in the North Atlantic's currents, for medieval Europeans, it felt like the heavens themselves had turned hostile. The ripple effects were staggering. Trade networks built over centuries collapsed as roads became impassable and ships risked being trapped in ice. The price of grain skyrocketed, leaving the poor to face starvation while the wealthy hoarded dwindling supplies. In places like Switzerland, entire villages were abandoned as glaciers swallowed pastures and homes. Yet amid this upheaval, something remarkable emerged: adaptation. Communities didn't just collapse, they transformed. Farmers in the Alps began terracing slopes to capture every drop of sunlight, while in the Low Countries, engineers perfected windmill technology to drain waterlogged fields. Even diets shifted, with people turning to hardier crops like rye and barley, or foraging for nuts and berries once considered famine food. This wasn't merely survival, it was innovation born of desperation. The Little Ice Age forced medieval societies to rethink everything from agriculture to architecture, proving that human ingenuity often flares brightest when pushed to the brink. And as we'll see, these adaptations didn't just help them endure, they laid the groundwork for changes that would echo far beyond the frost. In 1608, something extraordinary happened along the banks of the Thames, a sight so bizarre it would have seemed like fiction just decades earlier. The river, London's pulsing lifeline, froze so completely that people could stroll across its surface as if it were solid ground. But this wasn't just a temporary oddity. The ice held for weeks, thick enough to support bustling markets, roaring bonfires, and even printing presses churning out souvenirs on the spot. These frost fairs became legendary, with vendors selling roasted meat and spiced ale, musicians playing for crowds bundled in furs, and children skating where boats once sailed. On the surface, it was a spectacle of joy, a winter carnival defying the laws of nature. Yet behind the laughter and merriment, the frieze exposed a darker truth. The Thames wasn't just a backdrop for revelry, it was the city's economic artery. With the waterway immobilized, ships laden with grain from Europe couldn't dock. Fuel like coal, typically transported by barge, piled up uselessly in distant ports. Prices for bread and firewood soared, leaving the poor to shiver in cramped tenements, their breath visible in unheated rooms. The frost fairs, for all their charm, were a symptom of something far more precarious, a city teetering on the edge of crisis, masking its anxiety with forced celebration. What's fascinating is how Londoners turned this disaster into ingenuity. When the river froze, they didn't just wait for spring, they reinvented commerce on the ice. Merchants who'd relied on docks suddenly set up stalls in the middle of the Thames. Printers, unable to ship their wares, sold personalized keepsakes to fairgoers instead. Even the city's entertainers adapted, moving their performances onto this unlikely stage. This wasn't just survival, it was a masterclass in flexibility, proving that even in the harshest conditions, human creativity could carve out pockets of normalcy. But while London's frost fairs are the stuff of legend, the countryside faced far grimmer realities. Villagers reliant on single crops watched fields fail year after year, their soil locked in unyielding frost. In remote areas, the cold didn't bring temporary markets, it brought silence. Abandoned cottages, their roofs collapsed under snow, dotted landscapes like tombstones. The contrast couldn't be starker. Urban centers like London had the density and diversity to pivot, but rural communities often had no escape. Their survival depended on older, quieter strategies: communal grain stores, shared labor, and the painful knowledge that some winters would claim the weakest among them. This duality, the spectacle of the frost fairs and the suffering beyond the city, captures the essence of the Little Ice Age. It was an era of brutal contradictions, where resilience wore many faces. For some, it meant dancing on ice. For others, it meant enduring hunger in darkened hearths. But in both cases, the lesson was the same: adaptation wasn't a choice. It was the only way forward. High in the Swiss Alps, where the air thins and the winds howl like restless spirits, an entire village once vanished, not to war or plague, but to ice. The Grindelwald Glacier, a creeping giant of frozen water, advanced with such relentless force that it swallowed homes whole, crushing timber and stone beneath its weight. But the people of this valley didn't surrender to the ice. They did something extraordinary. They picked up their lives and carried them uphill, rebuilding their community piece by piece on slopes once considered too harsh for habitation. Archaeologists tracing their footsteps have uncovered something astonishing. Not just the ruins left behind, but the new foundations laid higher up the mountain. The relocated homes were built with thicker walls, their roofs pitched steeper to shed heavy snow. Fields were carved into terraces, maximizing every sliver of sun on the shorter growing days. Even their livestock adapted, with farmers breeding hardier goats that could forage on sparse alpine grasses. This wasn't just a retreat, it was a reinvention, a masterclass in listening to the land and rewriting the rules of survival. What's most striking isn't just their resilience, but their foresight. These villagers didn't wait for the glacier to reach their doorsteps. They observed the ice's slow march year after year and made the agonizing decision to leave before disaster struck. Imagine the courage that took uprooting generations of history based on a threat that moved inches each day. Yet their choice reveals a profound truth about survival during the Little Ice Age. Adaptation wasn't just about reacting to crisis. It was about reading the whispers of change before they became screams. The Alp story also shatters a myth about medieval people being passive victims of their environment. These villagers weren't just fleeing, they were engineering solutions. They redirected meltwater to irrigate new fields, used heated stones to thaw frozen soil for planting, and even adjusted their crop rotations to match the shifting seasons. In some high-altitude settlements, they cultivated a resilient strain of rye known as glacier grain, its roots clinging to thin soil where other crops would fail. This was agricultural innovation born of necessity, a testament to human ingenuity under pressure. And then there were the silent compromises, the losses woven into their survival. Moving uphill meant leaving behind fertile valley soil for rocky slopes. Families once self-sufficient now bartered wool and cheese for grain they could no longer grow. The very fabric of their culture shifted, with old songs about abundant harvests replaced by tales of endurance. Yet in this harsh new world, they found something unexpected: community bonds stronger than the ice. Villagers shared tools, rebuilt each other's barns, and pooled meager harvests to ensure no one starved. Survival, they learned, wasn't a solitary struggle. It was a collective act of defiance against the cold. Their legacy lingers today in the alpine meadows that still bloom each summer. A reminder that even the most unforgiving landscapes can nurture life when met with creativity and courage. The lesson isn't just about medieval resilience, it's about the choices we make when the world changes around us. Do we cling to what was or build anew? For the people of the Alps, the answer was carved into the mountains themselves, a story written not in ink, but in ice and stone. Somewhere in the rolling fields of Flanders, as frost crept deeper into the soil each winter, an unnamed peasant made a quiet observation that would change the course of European agriculture. While nobles and scholars debated the weather as divine punishment, this farmer noticed something pragmatic: the land wasn't dying, it was exhausted. Year after year of planting the same crops in the same fields had drained the soil of vitality, a problem magnified by the Little Ice Age's shorter growing seasons. But instead of resigning to hunger, he experimented with a radical idea. If the earth needed rest, why not give it in cycles? Thus emerged the three-field system, a deceptively simple revolution. Rather than dividing land into two plots, one planted, one fallow, this method added a third field for legumes like peas and lentils. The brilliance lay in the rotation: wheat or rye in the first field for staple grains, nitrogen-fixing legumes in the second to rejuvenate the soil, and the third left fallow to recover. Each year, the crops rotated, creating a self-sustaining rhythm that squeezed more food from stubborn earth. It wasn't just about yield, it was about balance. The legumes, often dismissed as peasant food, secretly nourished the soil with nitrogen, while fallow periods prevented the depletion that had doomed so many harvests. Word of this innovation spread not through royal decrees but through the quiet chatter of marketplaces and the shared labor of harvests. A neighbor copied the method, then another, until entire villages adopted it. By the 14th century, regions practicing crop rotation reported yields up to 50% higher than traditional farms, a lifeline when every bushel counted. What's remarkable is how this system turned limitations into advantages. Shorter growing seasons, the faster maturing legumes thrived. Poor soil, the rotation naturally rebuilt it. Even livestock benefited, as fallow fields could be used for grazing, their manure further enriching the land. But the real lesson here isn't just about agriculture, it's about perspective. While elites blamed supernatural forces or scrambled for scarce resources, this anonymous peasant looked downward, not upward, for solutions. His ingenuity wasn't born from privilege or education, but from the intimate knowledge of hands that worked the earth daily. In a time when survival often meant clinging to tradition, he dared to question why things had to stay the same. The three-field system's legacy outlasted the Little Ice Age, becoming the foundation of modern farming. Yet its greatest impact was cultural, proof that resilience could be cultivated quite literally from the ground up. When we marvel at today's agricultural technology, we're seeing echoes of that medieval breakthrough, a reminder that sometimes the most profound innovations begin with a single person noticing what everyone else overlooked. In the heart of Bavaria, where beer was more than a drink, it was liquid bread, a source of calories, and a sacred tradition, the Little Ice Age posed an existential threat. Barley, the golden backbone of brewing, began failing as summers grew too short and cool for proper ripening. But rather than let their kettles go cold, German brewers did something revolutionary. They looked past tradition and reached for unlikely substitutes: rye, wheat, and eventually even the humble potato. This wasn't just about saving beer, it was about preserving a way of life when nature seemed determined to take it away. The shift to rye was particularly ingenious. Unlike finicky barley, rye thrived in poor soils and resisted frost, its hardy stalks bending but rarely breaking under late spring snows. Brewers quickly discovered that rye beer, though darker and sharper than traditional brews, carried a robust flavor that won over drinkers. Some even preferred it, sparking regional specialties like Roggenbier, a rye-based ale that's still brewed today. But the real breakthrough came when brewers experimented with potatoes, a new world crop initially met with suspicion. Boiled and fermented, potatoes yielded a clean, neutral alcohol that could stretch dwindling grain supplies. This innovation didn't just keep taverns open, it quietly revolutionized famine food. What's often overlooked is how these desperate experiments reshaped entire diets. When brewers used rye or potatoes, they created byproducts like spent grains and mash, which were repurposed into hearty breads and soups. In a cruel twist, the very scarcity that threatened communities also forced them to diversify their food sources, making diets more resilient. Peasants who once relied on wheat or barley now discovered the virtues of overlooked crops, some of which packed more nutrients than their traditional staples. Brewers unintentionally became culinary pioneers. The cultural ripple effects were profound. Beer was more than sustenance in medieval Germany. It was a symbol of community, a centerpiece of festivals, and a safer alternative to polluted water. By keeping the brew flowing, these artisans preserved social cohesion in villages where hunger could have bred despair. Taverns remained gathering places where news was exchanged. disputes were settled, and bonds were strengthened over shared steins. The act of drinking together, even with altered recipes, became an act of defiance against the cold. This story isn't just about adaptation, it's about the hidden ways culture drives survival. When climate pressures forced brewers to innovate, they didn't just salvage a beverage, they reshaped agriculture, nutrition, and social rituals in ways that outlasted the Little Ice Age itself. Their legacy lingers in every frost-resistant crop we take for granted today, and in the enduring truth that necessity doesn't just breed invention, it sometimes brews it. Deep beneath the Austrian Alps, where winter's grip lingered longest, men with lanterns carved a labyrinth of tunnels into the earth's heart. The miners of Hallstatt weren't digging for gold or silver. They sought something far more precious in an age of scarcity: salt. As the Little Ice Age tightened its hold, surface deposits of this white gold dwindled, forcing miners to venture deeper than ever before. What they found would rewrite the rules of survival. The salt veins they uncovered weren't just geological curiosities, they were economic lifelines. In a world without refrigeration, salt was the difference between sustenance and spoilage. A single block could preserve an entire winter's worth of meat, fish, and vegetables, staving off famine when crops failed. But Hallstatt's miners did more than extract salt. They perfected an underground industry. Timber-reinforced shafts plunged hundreds of feet below ground, while ingenious drainage systems kept floodwaters at bay. Their tools, preserved in the salt's antiseptic embrace, reveal a level of craftsmanship that rivaled surface workshops. Leather gloves, woven ropes, and even a prehistoric backpack suggest these weren't desperate laborers but skilled professionals working with precision. The real marvel was how this subterranean world fueled an entire economy. Salt from Hallstatt traveled on sledges and river barges to markets across Europe, traded for grain from warmer regions or iron for tools. Miners earned enough to afford imported luxuries like Mediterranean pottery and Baltic amber, unthinkable comforts for most during the era's hardships. The town itself became a medieval boomtown with houses clinging to cliffs above the mines, their wooden balconies stacked like stairways to the sky. Even death reflected their prosperity. Elaborate graves held finely worked bronze jewelry and weapons, signaling wealth born from the earth's depths. But the story of Hallstatt isn't just about salt, it's about the unexpected opportunities hidden in crisis. While surface communities struggled with failing fields, these miners turned inward, literally and figuratively. Their success reveals a broader truth of the Little Ice Age. Survival wasn't just about enduring the cold, but finding niches where its grip was weakest. For coastal towns, that meant turning to the sea. For mountain villages, it meant terracing slopes. But for Hallstatt, salvation lay underground, in the glittering veins of a mineral that made decay pause and hunger retreat. The legacy of these miners echoes in our own era of climate uncertainty. Their story reminds us that resilience isn't always about fighting change. Sometimes it's about digging deeper, both into the earth and into human ingenuity. As we face our own environmental shifts, Hallstatt stands as a testament to the power of adaptation, proving that even in the darkest tunnels there's light and sometimes salt to be found. While inland Europe grappled with frozen rivers and impassable roads, a league of merchants turned to the one pathway that refused to stay closed: the sea. The Hanseatic League, a network of trading cities stretching from London to Novgorod, didn't just endure the Little Ice Age, they thrived in it, their ships cutting through icy waters like needles, stitching together an unraveling continent. At its peak, this coalition of nearly 200 towns and ports moved more than just goods. It moved hope, carrying Baltic grain to Flanders, Norwegian timber to England, and Russian furs to markets where winter's bite had grown deadly. What set these traders apart wasn't just their courage but their systems. While others saw chaos, the Hanseatic merchants built order. They standardized barrel sizes so grain could be traded without dispute in any port. They developed insurance systems to share the risks of shipwrecks and piracy. They even established contours, fortified trading posts where goods could be stored safely during unpredictable winters. In the freezing port of Bergen, Norway, the League's Brigand district became a marvel of logistics warehouses stacked like dominoes along the waterfront, their wooden planks stained black by centuries of salt and fish oil, each building a node in a vast survival network. The real genius lay in their flexibility. When traditional grain routes faltered, they pivoted to fish. Stockfish, dried to last years without spoiling, became the protein that saved millions from starvation. Herring, suddenly abundant as cold waters shifted fish migration patterns, was salted and shipped by the barrel load. Timber, once a secondary trade, surged in value as cities desperate for fuel stripped local forests bare. The League didn't just adapt to scarcity, they turned it into an art form, reading the climate's disruptions like a map to new opportunities. But this wasn't just about commerce, it was about urban survival. Take Lübeck, the League's beating heart. When frosts killed nearby crops, the city didn't starve. Its merchants tapped into a web of contacts stretching to the wheat fields of Poland and the rye markets of Prussia. While isolated villages withered, Hanseatic cities grew taller, their stepped gable houses climbing skyward as populations swelled with refugees fleeing rural collapse. Streets once lined with local craftsmen now bristled with exotic goods, Danish honey, Russian wax, even Mediterranean spices traded at markups that funded civic granaries. The League's wealth built walls, hospitals, and guild halls, turning climate chaos into urban renaissance. Yet the system had cracks. Not every city could afford Hanseatic prices, and tensions flared when hungry locals watched grain ships sail past their harbors to wealthier buyers. In England, riots erupted over foreigners exporting food during shortages. The League responded with ruthless pragmatism, blockading ports that defied their rules, bribing officials to secure privileges, even employing private armies to guard their convoys. Their success bred resentment, planting seeds of nationalism that would eventually unravel their dominance. The lesson here isn't just about medieval trade routes. It's about the double-edged sword of interconnectedness. The Hanseatic League proved that networks can buffer against local disasters, but they also create dependencies. When the climate shifts, who gets fed first? Who decides which city survives? These questions, first whispered in frosty 14th century harbors, echo uncomfortably today as we face our own era of disruption. The League's ships may be long gone, but their legacy of resilience, ruthlessness, and the high cost of survival still floats on the tide of history. In the winter of 1481, a strange new city rose within the walls of Paris, not of stone and timber, but of desperation. Tens of thousands of rural poor, their fields frozen solid and livestock dead, trudged through the city gates with hollow eyes and empty hands. Chroniclers described the scene as a living tide, families huddled under bridges, children wrapped in rags, their breath curling like smoke in the frigid air. The grand cathedrals and palaces of the French capital now shared streets with shanties built from scavenged planks and tattered blankets. But what unfolded next wasn't just tragedy, it was the birth of something revolutionary. Paris responded with a patchwork of compassion that would shock modern sensibilities. Monasteries, traditionally closed to outsiders, flung open their gates, turning cloisters into dormitories. Wealthy guilds, fearing unrest, funded soup kitchens that doled out coarse bread and thin pottage, meager by today's standards. but enough to keep starvation at bay. Even King Louis XI, a ruler not known for generosity, ordered bakeries to sell loaves at half price during the worst months. This wasn't charity as we think of it, it was survival pragmatism. A starving populace, the elites understood, was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The real innovation came from the grassroots. Neighborhoods organized, bourses de pauvres, literally poor exchanges, where those with a little extra could leave firewood or dried peas for neighbors to take anonymously. Butchers donated offal and bones for communal stews, while laundresses offered to mend clothes in exchange for help hauling water. These weren't acts of pure altruism, they were social contracts forged in frost. In a world without welfare systems, mutual aid became the glue holding society together. Yet the crisis also exposed brutal divides. City officials, terrified of disease, forced beggars into makeshift camps outside the walls, where overcrowding bred typhus and dysentery. Some churches preached that the poor were being punished for sin, turning away the sickest, and when spring came, those who'd survived found no welcome. Paris wanted its streets back. Authorities issued decrees banning begging, driving the displaced into neighboring towns until the next winter's freeze sent them wandering again. What makes this moment pivotal isn't just the suffering, but the precedents it set. The soup kitchens of 1481 evolved into France's first public hospices. The Guild's emergency measures laid groundwork for early social safety nets. Even the cruelest policies reflected a dawning recognition. In an interconnected world, no one could ignore mass desperation. The beggars of Paris, though nameless in history, taught Europe a harsh lesson, that climate disaster doesn't discriminate between city and country, rich and poor. Their legacy lingers in every modern food bank and homeless shelter, silent reminders of a winter that reshaped what it means to care for one another. Amid the chaos of failing harvests and frozen rivers, an unlikely group of men in deep hooded robes became Europe's unsung lifeline, the Benedictine monks of Cluny. While nobles waged wars and peasants scrambled to survive, these scribes bent over parchment in unheated scriptoriums, their ink freezing between strokes. But what they recorded wasn't just prayers, it was a meticulous archive of survival. Weather patterns, crop yields, even the migration habits of birds, all were logged in margins of illuminated manuscripts, creating a medieval database of resilience. Their greatest contribution lay in codifying what others saw as folk wisdom. A farmer's trick to bury grapevines before winter, documented the exact spacing of turnip rows that maximized frost protection. Noted, even failures mattered. Manuscripts from 1420 recorded how planting barley too early led to sprouted seeds rotting under late snow. This wasn't just observation, it was the birth of applied climate science. Monks cross-referenced records across decades, spotting patterns invisible to those living hand to mouth. When they advised villagers to switch from wheat to rye, it wasn't guesswork, it was data-driven survival. The scriptorium's real power emerged in its role as a knowledge sanctuary. As famine scattered communities and oral traditions faded, monasteries preserved techniques that might otherwise have been lost. Their libraries became living seed banks of information, where a single parchment could hold the key to reviving a region's agriculture. Take the Cluny Almanac, a 12th century text rediscovered during the worst frosts of the Little Ice Age. Its pages detailed ancient Roman cold weather farming methods, techniques abandoned during warmer centuries but suddenly vital again. Monks didn't just store this knowledge, they translated it, adapted it, and walked it barefoot to struggling villages. Yet their work transcended practicality. In an age where many saw the cold as divine punishment, the monks framed resilience itself as sacred. Manuscripts blended soil advice with psalms, grafting spiritual meaning onto survival. A marginal illustration might show Saint Benedict blessing a plough alongside verses about perseverance. This fusion of faith and pragmatism offered something rare hope rooted in action. A peasant hearing a monk's advice wasn't just learning farming, he was being shown God's hand in the very act of adaptation. This intellectual legacy challenges modern assumptions about medieval thought. Far from rejecting science, these monks practiced a form of it, testing, recording, and refining. Their greatest innovation wasn't any single technique, but the very idea that knowledge could outlast its creators. When we today digitize climate data or bank heirloom seeds, we're walking a path first cleared by robed figures huddled over candlelit parchment. Their lesson endures. Survival isn't just about enduring the present, it's about preserving the tools to rebuild the future. In the summer of 1315, the skies over northern Europe seemed to weep without end. Rain fell in sheets for months on end, drowning fields, rotting grain in the stalks, and turning roads into impassable quagmires. Rivers burst their banks, swallowing entire villages in churning brown waters. This was no ordinary storm. It was the opening act of the Great Famine, a catastrophe that would claim millions of lives. But amid the rising waters and crumbling harvests, something extraordinary unfolded. Columns of desperate people, barefoot and draped in sackcloth, began marching across the sodden landscape. These weren't armies or refugees, they were penitents, convinced their suffering was a divine test, and their only hope lay in collective atonement. The processions were unlike anything seen before. Whole villages would gather at dawn, led by priests carrying relics of saints, their voices rising in unison through the downpour. Farmers left their drowning fields, blacksmiths abandoned cold forges, even children joined the solemn marches, their small feet churning mud as they chanted psalms. Some groups traveled for weeks, covering hundreds of miles to reach sacred sites like Canterbury or Chartres, where they believed miracles might bloom from their devotion. The sheer scale of these movements defied logic. Here were people who could barely feed themselves, yet they invested precious energy in walking nowhere, their only sustenance the thin broth handed out at wayside shrines. Modern eyes might dismiss these marches as superstition, but their true power lay beyond meteorology. When the rains didn't cease, when the famine only deepened, something unexpected happened. The very act of marching together forged bonds stronger than hunger. Neighbors who'd once squabbled over property lines now shared cloaks against the rain. Strangers from distant valleys exchanged survival tips: which wild roots could be boiled safely, how to preserve meat without salt. The processions became living networks of knowledge and mutual aid, their routes tracing invisible safety nets across the disaster zone. Church records from the time reveal a fascinating paradox. While the pilgrimages failed in their stated purpose, the rains continued for another 2 years. They succeeded spectacularly as social glue. Villages that participated in processions reported lower rates of infighting and higher cooperation during recovery. Some historians argue these marches functioned as psychological triage, giving people an outlet for despair that might otherwise have turned inward or erupted into violence. The shared rhythm of walking, chanting, and suffering together created a kind of collective resilience, a reminder that no one was alone in their struggle. Perhaps the most poignant legacy of these rain pilgrims lies in what they left behind. Along old procession routes, archaeologists have found small offerings tucked into tree hollows or beneath stones: a carved wooden saint, a child's worn shoe, a handful of wheat kernels saved from the last good harvest. These weren't just prayers for divine intervention. They were declarations of human stubbornness, physical proof that even in the face of impossible odds, people insisted on hope. The rains eventually passed, the fields dried, and life crept back, but the memory of those sodden marches lingered in village stories for generations, a testament to the unquantifiable power of facing disaster together, step by muddy step. When the first hailstorm destroyed the wheat fields of Trier in 1585, the villagers didn't blame the sky, they pointed fingers at a reclusive widow named Margaret. Her crime, muttering to herself while collecting herbs near the riverbank weeks earlier. As the Little Ice Age's grip tightened, such accusations became horrifyingly common across Europe. Communities drowning in fear and hunger began seeing witchcraft in every misfortune: blighted crops, stillborn livestock, even unseasonable frosts. But what's chilling isn't just the superstition. It's how climate disaster twisted neighbor against neighbor, turning weather into a weapon of social control. Records from witch trials reveal a disturbing pattern. Over 60% of accusations mentioned weather manipulation, with women like Scotland's Agnes Sampson confessing under torture to sailing in sieves to summon storms. In Switzerland, entire valleys held mass trials targeting weather witches after consecutive harvests failed. The evidence was always circumstantial: an argument before a hailstorm, a peculiar birthmark, or simply being the wrong person in the wrong place during desperate times. Authorities, eager to placate terrified populations, often encouraged these hunts. In Bamberg, Germany, the Prince Bishop built a dedicated witch house with torture chambers, executing over 600 people between 1626 and 1630, the same years the region saw its worst frosts in living memory. Yet this tragedy holds an overlooked lesson about the psychology of crisis. When faced with forces beyond comprehension or control, humans often seek someone or something to hold responsible. The weather witch phenomenon wasn't just ignorance, it was a grotesque coping mechanism, a way to make chaos feel intentional and therefore stoppable. If storms were caused by a witch's curse rather than climatic shifts, then burning her might bring back the sun. This twisted logic offered a perverse sense of agency in an era when nature seemed irrevocably broken. Contrast this with communities that channeled fear into cooperation. In the Dutch village of Oudwater, officials famously resisted witch hysteria by developing a weighing house, a scale to disprove accusations that witches were unnaturally light. Their method wasn't just scientific, it was profoundly humane, recognizing that survival required unity, not scapegoats. Elsewhere, towns pooled resources to build communal granaries rather than hunting witches, prioritizing shared security over superstition. The difference between these responses wasn't intelligence or education, it was leadership. Where authorities amplified fear, violence flourished. Where they modeled pragmatism, resilience took root. The witch trials' darkest legacy may be their cautionary relevance today. When climate disasters strike, we still see surges in conspiracy theories, claims that wildfires are secretly started by governments or that droughts are engineered by shadowy elites. The targets change, but the impulse remains to replace paralyzing uncertainty with a narrative of blame. The Little Ice Age reminds us that survival isn't just about adapting to nature. It's about resisting the temptation to turn fear into fury. The true test of any society isn't how it endures hardship, but who it chooses to sacrifice along the way. Off the coast of Iceland, where glaciers loomed like frozen sentinels and the growing season shrank to just weeks, farmers faced an impossible choice: starve or abandon the land entirely. But rather than surrender to hunger, they did something extraordinary. They turned their backs on the soil and waded into the waves, transforming themselves from struggling agriculturalists into some of history's most resourceful fishermen. The cod that swarmed Iceland's icy waters became their new currency, but preserving it required ingenuity as sharp as their harpoons. the breakthrough came not from catching fish, that was the easy part, but from mastering the art of drying them. On wooden racks called H-jaller, exposed to the relentless North Atlantic winds, cod fillets lost up to 80% of their weight, becoming lightweight, indestructible slabs of protein. This wasn't just food preservation, it was alchemy. The process, perfected over generations, leveraged Iceland's very adversities, the cold, the wind, even the lack of trees for smoking, to create a product that could last for years without salt or refrigeration. A single dried cod could be boiled into a dozen meals, its richness defying its shriveled appearance. Soon, these humble fish became a medieval superfood, traded as far as Venice and Constantinople. European monasteries stocked them for fast days, sailors relied on them for long voyages, and armies carried them as campaign rations. The trade was so lucrative that Icelandic families paid taxes in dried cod, and disputes over fishing rights sparked bloody feuds recorded in sagas. But the real marvel was how this maritime pivot reshaped society. Coastal villages, once peripheral, became bustling hubs. Boat-building techniques advanced exponentially, with vessels growing sturdier to handle rougher seas. Even language adapted. Old Norse developed specialized terms for different wind directions critical to fishing, words still used by Icelandic sailors today. The Icelandic model reveals a profound truth about resilience. Sometimes survival means not just adapting to your environment, but letting it remake you entirely. Farmers who'd never held a net became navigators reading currents like field rows. Women, traditionally excluded from seafaring, took charge of processing and trading the catch, gaining economic clout. The very identity of a people shifted from landlocked to seafaring, proving that cultural flexibility can be as vital as technological innovation. This fishing revolution didn't happen in isolation. Across Europe, the Little Ice Age sparked similar bursts of ingenuity. Dutch engineers refined windmill designs to drain flooded fields, turning marshes into fertile polders. In the Alps, glassmakers developed thicker panes to insulate greenhouse-like orangeries for growing citrus in snowbound valleys. Each breakthrough shared a common thread, not just solving immediate problems, but creating systems that turned constraints into advantages. The dried cod, the windmill, the greenhouse all were born from necessity, yet outlasted the crisis that created them. What unites these innovations is their refusal to see scarcity as the end of the story. When the old ways failed, medieval people didn't just tweak them, they reinvented the rules entirely. The lesson for our own era of climate uncertainty isn't just about fish or windmills. It's about the courage to let go of what no longer works and embrace the uncharted paths that hardship reveals. After all, the future doesn't always come from holding on sometimes. It's waiting where the land runs out and the waves begin. Imagine waking up every morning to a home filled with thick, acrid smoke, your eyes stinging, your lungs heavy with soot. This was daily life in medieval Europe before the chimney's rise. Open hearths, the heart of every household, warmed families but at a cruel cost. Inefficient fires devoured precious firewood while smoke curled back into rooms instead of escaping. As the Little Ice Age deepened and forests dwindled, this design flaw became deadly. But tucked away in the corners of history is a quiet revolution, one that didn't involve kings or battles, but mortar, bricks, and a simple shift in how we let smoke escape. The transition from open hearths to enclosed chimneys seems obvious now, but its impact was nothing short of transformative. By funneling smoke upward through a narrow flue, chimneys achieved two miracles. They trapped heat inside rooms rather than letting it vanish into rafters, and they banished toxic fumes that had plagued generations. A fireplace with a well-designed chimney could heat a room with half the wood an open hearth required. A lifeline when every log counted. In places like the Swiss Alps, where winters stretched endlessly, families reported sleeping through the night for the first time without coughing fits or headaches. The chimney didn't just warm homes, it cleared the air quite literally for new ways of living. What's often overlooked is how this innovation reshaped architecture and, by extension, society. Homes could now be built taller with multiple floors, since smoke no longer needed to disperse through a single large room. Bedrooms moved upstairs, privacy increased, and the very concept of domestic space evolved. In cities like London, row houses with narrow chimneys began to replace sprawling single-room dwellings, allowing urban populations to grow denser without suffocating in smoke. Even art reflected the change. Medieval illustrations before the 15th century show interiors hazy with fumes, while later paintings depict clear, well-lit rooms, a subtle testament to the chimney's invisible gift. But the real heroes of this story were the nameless masons who perfected chimney design through trial and error. They discovered that a slight taper in the flue improved draft, pulling smoke upward more efficiently. They learned to line chimneys with smooth clay to reduce creosote buildup, preventing fires. In some regions, they even incorporated twists in the flue to slow heat loss, a medieval precursor to modern energy efficiency. These weren't grand inventions celebrated in chronicles. They were incremental improvements passed from one builder to another, honed through generations of quiet observation. The chimney's legacy extends beyond warmth. By reducing smoke inhalation, it likely saved more lives than any medieval doctor. Chronic respiratory ailments, once accepted as inevitable, began to decline. The ability to burn cheaper, smokier fuels like peat without poisoning households gave the poor a fighting chance against winter. And perhaps most profoundly, the chimney created something previously unimaginable: comfort. For the first time, gathering around the fire became a pleasure rather than an endurance test, a small but radical shift in the human experience of cold. This humble tube of brick and mortar teaches us that survival isn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes it's the smallest adjustments, redirecting a draft, conserving a scrap of heat, breathing cleaner air, that ripple across centuries. In an age of climate challenges, the chimney stands as a reminder: innovation doesn't need to be flashy to be revolutionary. It just needs to solve a problem, one wisp of smoke at a time. While Europe shivered under the Little Ice Age's grip, the glassmakers of Venice faced a paradox: how to sustain an art form fueled by fire when firewood itself was vanishing. Their furnaces, once roaring with extravagant heat, now threatened to consume the very forests that kept them alive. But rather than sacrifice their centuries-old craft, these artisans did something extraordinary. They reinvented fire itself. Through painstaking experimentation, they redesigned their kilns to burn hotter with less fuel, turning scarcity into a catalyst for brilliance. The secret lay in geometry and airflow. Traditional square furnaces wasted heat through corners where flames languished. Venetian innovators reshaped them into sleek cylinders, concentrating heat at the center where glass pots melted. They added secondary chambers to recapture escaping warmth, channeling it back to the core like a thermal echo. Most crucially, they perfected the loom, a high-arch draft system that pulled air upward with such precision that temperatures soared while wood consumption plummeted. A master glassblower could now work all day with logs that once burned out by noon, a miracle of efficiency in an age of deprivation. This technical leap preserved more than just fuel. It safeguarded Venice's economic lifeline. Glassmaking wasn't just an art here, it was a state secret guarded as fiercely as any military strategy. The city's famed cristallo, a crystal-clear glass so pure it rivaled quartz, commanded prices that filled the treasury. But maintaining its quality demanded consistent, searing heat. A single misfired batch could mean financial ruin. The redesigned furnaces didn't just solve a fuel crisis, they ensured Venice's monopoly on luxury glass survived the coldest decades. Yet the true marvel was how constraints birthed new beauty. Shortages of imported soda ash forced glassmakers to experiment with local materials, accidentally creating richer hues. The iconic Venetian red emerged when they substituted iron-rich sands from nearby riverbeds. Thin-shelled goblets, initially a response to scarce materials, became coveted for their delicate elegance. Even the iconic Murano beads, later traded for spices and gold in Africa, grew smaller and more intricate as resources dwindled, their value soaring precisely because they did more with less. The glassmakers' legacy extends beyond art. Their furnaces became early models for industrial efficiency, principles that would later shape steam engines and blast furnaces. More profoundly, they proved that tradition needn't stagnate. It can evolve under pressure, shedding waste while preserving essence. Today, when climate challenges push us to rethink energy use, Venice's glassblowers offer a silent lesson. Sometimes the path forward isn't abandoning what we love, but refining how we sustain it. While frozen fields starved medieval farmers, an unlikely savior emerged from the pastures, the humble sheep. Unlike temperamental wheat or delicate grapes, these woolly creatures thrived in the Little Ice Age's cooler summers and damp meadows. Their thick fleeces grew denser in the cold, turning a climate curse into a booming commodity. From the rolling hills of England to the bustling markets of Flanders, Europe's economies began to pivot, stitching together a new survival strategy thread by thread. England's transformation was particularly dramatic. As crop failures devastated traditional agriculture, landowners realized something revolutionary. Sheep required less labor than grain, could graze on marginal lands unfit for farming, and produced a product that could be stored indefinitely. Monasteries, often the largest landowners, led the charge, converting plowed fields into vast sheep runs. By 1350, some Cistercian abbeys owned flocks numbering in the tens of thousands, their wool exports financing towering cathedrals and illuminated manuscripts. The wool wasn't just warm, it was wealth incarnate, traded across Europe like a medieval currency. Flanders became the loom where England's wool was woven into gold. Cities like Bruges and Ghent, their canals choked with barges of raw fleece, perfected textile production on an industrial scale. Guilds of dyers, fullers, and weavers turned wool into luxurious broadcloths, dyed vibrant scarlet with rare insect-based kermes or rich black with oak gall ink. These fabrics clothed kings and bankers, their value so immense that bolts of Flemish cloth were used as collateral for international loans. The trade created Europe's first economic powerhouses outside nobility, merchant oligarchs who built town halls with spires rivaling church steeples, a silent challenge to feudal hierarchies. But this wool boom wasn't just about commerce, it rewrote social contracts. In England, the shift from grain to grazing displaced thousands of peasant farmers, fueling unrest that would culminate in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Yet in Flanders, textile work offered new opportunities. Women dominated the spinning trades, earning wages that granted unprecedented independence. The climate-driven rise of wool even birthed early labor movements. In 1370, Ghent's weavers staged history's first recorded strike, demanding fair pay for turning England's misfortune into Flemish luxury. The most enduring legacy, though, was how wool knit together a fragmented continent. Italian bankers financed English sheep farms, German miners supplied the copper vats for Flemish dyes, and Hanseatic merchants shipped finished cloth to Russia and the Levant. What began as a local adaptation to cooling weather became the backbone of medieval globalization, proving that even in the face of climatic upheaval, human networks could weave scarcity into prosperity. The lesson lingers in every modern economic pivot that survival isn't just about enduring change, but spinning it into gold. The year 1348 should have been a time of utter despair across Europe. The Black Death had swept through cities and villages like a scythe, leaving behind empty homes and untended fields. Entire families vanished, their doors left ajar, their livestock wandering untethered. Yet from this unimaginable loss emerged something unexpected, a flicker of hope for those who remained. With nearly half the population gone, the basic rules of society began to shift in ways no one could have predicted. Labor, once cheap and abundant, suddenly became precious. Fields still needed plowing, cloth demanded weaving, and buildings required repair, but there were far fewer hands to do the work. For the first time in living memory, peasants held bargaining power. A day laborer who once earned a pittance could now demand double or triple his former wages. Skilled craftsmen found themselves courted by competing lords, their talents worth their weight in silver. Even serfs, traditionally bound to the land, discovered they could negotiate better terms or simply walk away to higher-paying opportunities. The feudal system, built on the assumption of endless expendable workers, began to crack under the weight of its own scarcity. This economic upheaval wasn't just about coins changing hands, it reshaped daily life in startling ways. Diets improved as meat, once a luxury reserved for elites, became more accessible to commoners. With fewer mouths to feed, surviving farmers could afford to sell their surplus rather than surrender it as tithes. Houses grew sturdier as carpenters, no longer swamped with work, had time to craft proper joints instead of crude notches. Even fashion reflected the change. Ordinary townsfolk began wearing fitted clothing, a subtle rebellion against the shapeless tunics that had marked their lower status for centuries. But progress never comes without resistance. Panicked nobles issued laws capping wages, threatening fines or worse for anyone who dared demand fair pay. The Statute of Labourers in England went so far as to order workers to accept pre-plague rates, a desperate attempt to turn back time. These edicts sparked resentment that would simmer for decades, fueling revolts like the Peasants' Rebellion of 1381. The ruling class had glimpsed a terrifying truth that catastrophe could rewrite the social contract, and not always in their favor. The plague's aftermath forces us to confront a difficult question: can widespread suffering ever create conditions for meaningful change? The answer lies not in celebrating death, but in recognizing how survivors rebuilt. When systems break, even briefly, they leave space for reinvention. The Black Death didn't just take lives, it exposed the fragility of hierarchies that had seemed eternal. What followed was a messy, uneven climb toward something fairer, proving that even in humanity's darkest hours, the seeds of a better future can take root. Standing knee-deep in brackish water with storms howling overhead, Dutch farmers faced an impossible equation: how to feed growing populations when rising seas and relentless rains kept swallowing their fields. But where others saw only flooded wasteland, the Dutch saw potential. Armed with nothing more than wooden gears, canvas sails, and an unshakable determination to bend physics to their will. The windmill, once a simple grain grinder, was about to become Europe's most sophisticated climate adaptation tool, one that wouldn't just cope with water, but conquer it. The breakthrough came when engineers realized windmills could do more than harness energy, they could move it. By connecting mill mechanisms to Archimedes' screws and water wheels, they created relentless aquatic pumps. Each rotation lifted thousands of gallons from waterlogged fields into drainage canals, which funneled the overflow back to the sea. It was a liquid conveyor belt powered by breeze alone, transforming marshes into orderly grids of fertile polders, land reclaimed from the waves. The scale was staggering. By 1650, over 26,000 acres of new farmland shimmered where there had once been only swamp, all drained by an army of whirling wooden sentinels. What made this system revolutionary wasn't just the technology, but the social contracts behind it. Maintaining polders required unprecedented cooperation. Farmers formed water boards to oversee shared dikes and mills, their decisions binding entire communities. These boards, Europe's first democratic institutions, proved that environmental survival demanded collective governance. Neglect one mill's maintenance, and the whole region risked flooding. The Dutch called this mindset polder mentality, the understanding that against rising waters, individualism meant mutual ruin. The windmills themselves evolved into masterpieces of adaptive engineering. Millwrights designed rotating caps that could pivot to catch changing winds, while adjustable sails allowed fine-tuning for stormy weather. Some complexes became multi-tasking powerhouses, simultaneously draining land, grinding grain, and sawing timber. In the Zon district, over 600 industrial mills formed what historians now call the world's first automated production line, their collective hum audible for miles. This aquatic alchemy came at a cost. Draining peatlands caused the soil to compact and sink, ironically increasing flood risks over time, a lesson in unintended consequences that resonates today. Yet the Dutch response revealed their genius. They turned the problem into an opportunity. By alternating drainage with controlled flooding, they created nutrient-rich floating farms for dairy cattle, while excavated sediment built fortified dikes. Every challenge spawned innovation, every failure a new strategy. When the Little Ice Age's worst storms hit in the 17th century, sending tides crashing over coastal defenses, the Dutch didn't retreat, they built smarter. The iconic octagonal mills gave way to massive pumping stations, precursors to modern flood controls. Their legacy endures in Rotterdam's storm surge barriers and Venice's MOSE project, proving that medieval solutions still inform our climate resilience playbook. The windmills whisper a timeless truth. Survival isn't about resisting nature's rhythms, but learning to dance with them. High in the Swiss Alps, where summer grazing lasted barely 3 months and winter snows buried pastures for the rest of the year, herders faced a dilemma: how to preserve milk's fleeting abundance into something that could outlast the cold. Their solution lay hidden in the mountains themselves, natural caves with steady temperatures hovering just above freezing, their walls lined with salt-rich minerals. Here, in these subterranean larders, Swiss herders perfected the art of cheese aging, turning perishable milk into wheels of sustenance that could endure for years. A single wheel of Gruyere, carefully tended in these caves, held enough calories to feed a family through the leanest winters. The process was deceptively simple, yet required generations of refinement. Fresh milk, carried in wooden buckets from highland pastures, was transformed into curds using rennet from calves' stomachs, a technique dating back to Roman times. But the magic happened in the caves. Workers rubbed the forming cheeses with brine-soaked cloths, encouraging the growth of beneficial molds that acted as natural preservatives. The cave's constant humidity prevented cracking, while cool temperatures slowed fermentation just enough to develop complex flavors without spoilage. Some wheels aged for decades, their rinds growing thick as tree bark, their interiors crystallizing into crunchy tyrosine pockets that burst with umami richness. What began as survival necessity birthed an economic revolution. By the 15th century, Alpine cheese had become currency, literally. Records show farmers paying tithes to monasteries in cheese wheels, while mercenaries took them as portable rations on campaigns. The famous Emmental, with its iconic holes formed by carbon dioxide bubbles, was so prized that counterfeiters would drill holes into inferior cheeses to mimic it. Entire villages organized as cooperatives to pool milk and share cave space, creating some of Europe's earliest collective dairies. The system was so efficient that when the Little Ice Age's worst famine struck, cheese-producing regions suffered far less than grain-dependent areas. Modern science has since revealed why these cave-aged cheeses were so resilient. The microbial ecosystems in Alpine caves are uniquely suited to cheese preservation, with native bacteria like Propionibacterium freudenreichii outcompeting harmful pathogens. The herders knew none of this, of course. They simply observed that cheeses stored near certain mineral deposits lasted longer. Their methods, honed through trial and error, anticipated modern food science by centuries. Today's controlled aging facilities, with their precise humidity and temperature regulation, are direct descendants of those fog-draped mountain caverns. The true brilliance of this system lay in its circularity. Herders used what the landscape provided: milk from alpine grazing cows, caves shaped by glaciers, even the wooden tools carved from nearby forests. Nothing was wasted. Whey, a byproduct of cheesemaking, was fed to pigs or fermented into rustic beers. Even the cave's cool air was harnessed, with some cellars designed so strategically that they required no artificial cooling even in summer. This wasn't just food preservation, it was a masterclass in sustainable adaptation, proving that survival need not mean conquering nature, but collaborating with it. Perhaps the most poignant legacy of Alpine cheesemaking is how it bound communities together. The seasonal movement of herds to high pastures, the transhumance, became a cultural ritual, with families spending summers in remote chalets together. Cheese caves served as communal gathering spots, where news was exchanged and traditions passed down alongside the turning of wheels. In a world increasingly disconnected from its food sources, these practices remind us that resilience isn't just stored in cheese cellars. It's cultivated in the shared labor of hands and the patience of generations. While Western Europe's wheat fields withered under the Little Ice Age's unrelenting chill, a different grain was quietly thriving in the north: rye, tough, frost-resistant, and willing to grow in poor soils. This humble crop became the backbone of a survival network stretching from the Baltic's frozen ports to the starving cities of Flanders and England. But the real marvel wasn't just the grain itself. It was the sprawling, improvised trade system that moved it. When traditional suppliers failed, medieval merchants pieced together a lifeline across stormy seas and iced over rivers, proving that necessity doesn't just invent new tools, it rewrites entire maps. The Baltic rye trade exploded out of desperation. In years when French or English harvests collapsed, prices for wheat could triple in weeks, leaving bread, the staple of every meal, out of reach for the poor. Enter the merchants of Danzig and Riga, who realized their surplus rye, once considered coarse peasant fare, could fetch premium prices abroad. Soon, fleets of cog ships, sturdy, broad-beamed vessels designed for icy waters, were threading through the Øresund Strait, their holds packed with dark, dense loaves of rye bread or sacks of the grain itself. These weren't luxury goods, they were bulk cargoes of survival, traded not for profit alone but because hungry populations meant unstable markets, and unstable markets were bad for business. What made this system revolutionary was its scale and speed. At its peak in the 15th century, the Baltic grain trade could move enough rye to feed 500,000 people annually, a staggering feat for medieval logistics. The Hanseatic League, that network of merchant cities we've discussed before, established standardized measures to prevent disputes. The last, a unit equivalent to about 2 tons of grain, became the common language of famine relief. Warehouses in Bruges and Amsterdam stockpiled Baltic rye like modern strategic reserves. releasing it gradually to prevent price spikes. This wasn't just commerce, it was early crisis management, a recognition that full bellies meant stable societies. The trade's ripple effects transformed economies far beyond the grain fields. In Poland and Prussia, landlords shifted vast acreages from wheat to rye, knowing its hardiness guaranteed sales even in brutal years. Millers from Ghent to London retooled their equipment to handle rye's tougher kernels, while bakers experimented with blending it into wheat flour to stretch supplies. Even piracy adapted. Privateers known as victual brothers specialized in hijacking grain ships, knowing their cargoes were ransom-worthy. The entire North Sea economy bent around this one crop, proving how climate shocks can reshape trade as profoundly as any treaty. But the Baltic rye trade's greatest legacy was its foreshadowing of globalization. When a poor harvest in England could be offset by surplus from Poland, when Dutch windmills ground grain shipped from Latvia, the medieval world glimpsed something radical: interdependence. The lesson wasn't lost on later generations. The same shipping routes that carried rye would one day ferry potatoes from the New World, linking continents in a web of food security. Today, when drought in Argentina affects soy prices in Tokyo, or war in Ukraine sends wheat costs soaring in Egypt, we're seeing echoes of that medieval innovation. Proof that survival has always been a team sport, even when the players are separated by seas and centuries. The next time you bite into a slice of dark rye bread, consider its hidden history. That earthy flavor carries more than just nutrients. It's the taste of human ingenuity under pressure, of networks forged by necessity, and of a truth as relevant now as it was 600 years ago. No one starves alone in a connected world. When Pieter Bruegel the Elder painted The Hunters in the Snow in 1565, he captured more than just a winter scene. He froze in time the soul of an era. The painting, with its weary huntsmen trudging past frozen ponds and villagers huddled around outdoor fires, wasn't imagined fantasy. It was documentary realism, brushed onto oak panel with the precision of a climate report. Across Europe, artists became unwitting historians of the Little Ice Age, their canvases preserving details no parchment could: the way snow clung to thatched roofs, how children's breath curled in icy air, the peculiar blue-gray light that bathed landscapes under perpetually overcast skies. What makes these artworks so revealing is their casual intimacy. Look closely at Bruegel's skaters on frozen canals, their postures relaxed, their activities routine. This wasn't a freak storm, it was normalcy. Dutch winter landscapes by Averkamp show markets operating on ice, couples courting on sleighs, even beggars shivering by makeshift shelters, all testifying to cold so enduring it reshaped social rhythms. Even religious art adapted. Traditional nativity scenes, once set in temperate Middle Eastern stables, began appearing in snow-covered Flemish barns, with Mary and Joseph bundled like local peasants. The sacred had literally chilled to match the lived experience. Beyond aesthetics, these paintings hold practical clues to survival. A detail in Bruegel's The Census at Bethlehem shows houses with steeply pitched roofs, an architectural adaptation to prevent snow buildup. Another panel reveals villagers storing firewood in covered sheds rather than stacked outdoors, a nod to fuel scarcity. Artists recorded innovations they likely took for granted: ice saws for cutting blocks to preserve food, double-glazed windows stuffed with straw for insulation, even early versions of skis for winter travel. These weren't symbolic flourishes, they were brushstroke how-to manuals for enduring the cold. The shift in palette tells its own story. Earlier medieval art glowed with gold leaf and warm earth tones, reflecting a sunnier world. By contrast, Little Ice Age paintings dominate with silvery grays, chilly blues, and muted greens. not just stylistic choice but accurate representation of dimmer, dust-filled skies from volcanic ash that helped trigger the cooling. Some scholars argue these works influenced perceptions of winter itself. Before, cold months were feared as harsh interlopers. Now they became subjects of beauty and even celebration. The very concept of a winter landscape as artistic genre was born from this climatic shift. Yet the most poignant testimony comes from personal diaries, often depicted in these paintings, open books on tables, letters in hands. When combined with actual surviving journals, a vivid picture emerges. A merchant's chronicle from Antwerp describes trading Turkish carpets for Russian furs as winters worsened. A nun's diary in Bavaria records inventing wool-lined gloves for scribes whose ink froze mid-word. These weren't grand historical narratives but small, human adaptations, the kind that rarely make chronicles but fill margins with life. The art of the Little Ice Age does more than document. It whispers a profound truth about cultural resilience. When climate changes, humans don't just alter what they do, they transform how they see. The snowy vistas of Bruegel and his contemporaries weren't mournful elegies for lost warmth. They were declarations of a new normal, proof that even in the face of relentless cold, beauty and meaning could still be carved from ice. In the quiet Norman village of St. Pierre-sur-Dives, where frost clung to the church's stone arches well into spring, a parish priest named Father Etienne did something extraordinary. He took up his quill and began documenting the world's slow descent into cold. Day after day, year after year, his careful hand recorded temperatures, rainfall, and the precise dates when apple blossoms withered or wheat sprouted. What began as a local record-keeping ritual became one of history's most valuable climate diaries, a parchment paper time capsule that would outlive its creator by centuries. Father Etienne's entries read like poetry written by a scientist. 22nd of April, 1483, one note begins. The river remains locked in ice though the feast of St. George has passed. The widow Lefebvre's lambs perished in last night's snowfall. Another laments, 3rd June 1485, no cherries for the festival. The trees bloomed too late, then rotted in unseasonable rain. These weren't just observations, they were acts of devotion. To the priest, tracking the seasons was a form of prayer, a way to witness God's creation in all its cruel beauty. His ink-stained fingers traced the unraveling of familiar rhythms. Each abnormal frost or failed harvest another verse in an elegy for the world he'd known. The true brilliance of his work lay in its methodical precision. While nobles chronicled battles and kings obsessed over dynasties, this unknown cleric measured reality in bushels and degrees. He noted how south-facing slopes yielded slightly more grain than north-facing ones, how certain apple varieties resisted late frosts better than others, even how the migratory patterns of starlings had shifted over his lifetime. Centuries before modern meteorology, Father Etienne was practicing phenology, the study of cyclical natural events, with the rigor of a laboratory researcher. His diaries, preserved by sheer luck in a monastery archive, would later help climatologists reconstruct the Little Ice Age's progression with startling accuracy. But the diaries reveal more than weather patterns. They capture human adaptation in real time. Scattered between frost dates and crop tallies are glimpses of survival strategies. Old Martine insists on planting her beans when the oak leaves reach the size of a mouse's ear. One entry muses, documenting folk wisdom that modern science now confirms as a reliable phenological indicator. Another describes villagers soaking seeds in brine to harden them against cold, a technique still used in some organic farming today. The priest himself experimented with mulching vines with straw after a particularly brutal winter, noting the results like a medieval agronomist. What makes Father Etienne's story so compelling is its quiet universality. He wasn't a genius inventor or a powerful leader, just a man who paid attention. In doing so, he proved how ordinary observation, when sustained over time, can become extraordinary science. His legacy whispers to us from the pages of climate history. That data isn't just numbers, it's the lived experience of people who came before us, their struggles and solutions etched in ink as permanent as the frost was transient. Today, when researchers input his painstaking records into climate models, they're not just crunching numbers, they're resurrecting conversations between a priest and the land he tended. Those yellowed pages hold a lesson for our own era of environmental uncertainty, that sometimes the most revolutionary act isn't grand innovation, but simply bearing witness day after frozen day. On the wind-battered shores of Greenland, where glaciers groaned and icebergs circled like wolves, the Norse settlers faced a choice: adapt or perish. Unlike the Dutch with their windmills or the Swiss with their cheese caves, these Vikings brought their Scandinavian ways with them and refused to let go. They built stone churches in the style of Norway, raised European cattle ill-suited to the tundra, and prayed for summers that never warmed enough to ripen their barley. All while Inuit hunters thrived just miles away, living off seal, whale, and fish in a harmony with the cold the Norse never learned. The tragedy wasn't sudden. For generations, Greenland's Vikings had warnings. Winters grew longer, pastures yielded less grass, cattle, starved and skeletal, had to be kept indoors for months, their manure piling up until the stench choked the very halls meant to protect them. Yet, even as their children's ribs showed through thin tunics, the settlers clung to what they knew. Excavations at Gardar reveal the absurdity. Elaborate stained glass imported for a bishop's chapel, while storage rooms held rotting hay instead of dried fish. Their sagas boasted of keeping Christian ways in this new land, as if piety could melt the ice. Meanwhile, the Inuit moved freely across the frozen seascape. Their toggle harpoons, designed to twist in a seal's flesh, made Norse spears look clumsy. Skin kayaks darted between icebergs while Viking boats sat icebound. When the Norse did reluctantly try fishing, they used nets meant for Baltic herring, catching nothing in Greenland's deeper waters. The bitter irony. Marine isotope analysis of Norse bones shows that toward the end, they did start eating seal, but only as famine food, scavenged from beaches rather than hunted. Pride, it seems, outweighed hunger until it was too late. Archaeologists find their final chapters written in middens refuse heaps that became diaries of decline. Early layers show beef bones and barley grains, later ones the bones of dogs and seabirds. The very last contained scraps of leather, chewed beyond nutritive value. At one farm, a solitary goat skeleton lies amid human remains, suggesting someone guarded the last livestock until starvation took them both. No war, no plague, just the slow unraveling of a people who defined themselves by what they refused to change. Their legacy haunts us not as a mystery, but as a mirror. The Greenland Vikings didn't fail because they lacked resources or courage. They failed because they mistook identity for inflexibility, tradition for immutability. In our own era of climate upheaval, their story whispers a warning. Survival doesn't care where your grandparents came from or how you've always done things. It only asks one question: are you willing to learn? While Moscow's boyars wrapped themselves in furs inside their opulent winter palaces, the peasants outside were literally digging for survival, burrowing into the earth like human roots seeking warmth. This stark contrast in cold weather adaptations reveals more than just medieval Russian architecture. it lays bare how disaster magnifies inequality, then as now. The boyars' winter residences were marvels of insulated excess. Double-thick walls stuffed with moss and flax trapped heat, while ceramic stoves called pechkas dominated rooms, not just for cooking, but as central heating systems with intricate flues circulating warmth through brick channels. Wealthy families commissioned elaborately tiled versions, their colorful patterns disguising the stove's life-saving function beneath aristocratic whimsy. Glass windows, a rare luxury, were layered with sheets of mica or bladder membrane to block drafts without obscuring light. These weren't just houses, they were climate-controlled fortresses, their very design broadcasting that the elite could bend winter itself to their comfort. Meanwhile, the peasantry turned to Zemlyanka's pit dwellings dug several feet below the frost line, their ceilings barely rising above ground level. A single stove vented through a thatched roof, its smoke hole doubling as the sole source of light. Families slept on raised platforms to avoid the coldest air pooling at floor level, while livestock often shared the space, their body heat supplementing the meager fire. Archaeological finds show creative adaptations. Hollowed-out logs channeled warmth under sleeping areas, while fermented manure packed between wall timbers provided cheap insulation. The same frozen rivers that supplied ice for the boyars' summer wine cellars became the peasants' only refrigeration. Meat stored in ice pits could last until spring, if wolves didn't sniff it out first. This divergence went beyond architecture, it dictated survival odds. Boyar households stockpiled firewood measured in cartloads, while peasants burned whatever they could scavenge, often inhaling toxic smoke from green wood or dung. When the year without summer struck in 1600 after the eruption of Huaynaputina, chronicles note wealthy Muscovites hosting frost feasts with imported Mediterranean fruits, while rural death tolls went unrecorded. The boyars' surplus became their safety net. Grain silos beneath their palaces could last years, whereas a single failed harvest doomed entire villages. Yet peasant ingenuity occasionally bridged the gap. Some Zemlyankas featured ingenious cold sinks, small pits dug deeper than the main floor to trap dense, chilly air below living spaces. Others incorporated underground root cellars accessible via interior tunnels, allowing food retrieval without venturing into deadly blizzards. These innovations hint at an uncomfortable truth: necessity often breeds sharper solutions than privilege. The boyars' winter palaces stagnated architecturally for centuries, while peasant designs evolved constantly under pressure, proof that luxury can blunt adaptation's edge. Today's echoes are unmistakable. Modern energy poverty mirrors the Zemlyanka's smoke-filled desperation, with low-income households still burning cheaper, dirtier fuels. The winter palace mentality persists in gated communities with backup generators while others freeze. The lesson carved into Moscow's frozen past isn't just about surviving cold. It's about recognizing how disaster slides down social slopes until someone builds a wall. And history whispers that those walls, no matter how thick, never hold forever. While French monks mourned vineyards lost to frost and German vintners watched their grapes wither on the vine, Spanish winemakers faced an unexpected opportunity. The same cooling that devastated northern Europe's wine regions left Spain's high plateaus and sun-baked valleys relatively unscathed. Even better, the milder temperatures balanced the fierce Iberian sun, creating conditions ripe for winemaking's golden age. But this wasn't just luck, it was a masterclass in adaptive opportunism where crisis became the cradle of innovation. The secret lay in Spain's geography, a quirk of mountains and microclimates. While the Pyrenees shielded the peninsula from the worst northern blasts, the central meseta's altitude kept nights cool enough to preserve acidity in grapes, even as days remained sun-drenched. Winemakers in Rioja and Ribera del Douro discovered their Tempranillo grapes, once considered rustic, now developed richer flavors as ripening slowed under the Little Ice Age's moderated heat. Meanwhile, coastal regions like Catalonia doubled down on drought-resistant Garnacha, its thick-skinned berries thriving where other varieties would have struggled. The shift wasn't gradual, it was a full-scale viticultural revolution, with entire villages replanting slopes in years rather than generations. What truly set Spain apart was its willingness to embrace the unconventional. While French vintners clung to tradition, Spaniards experimented with techniques that would have been heresy in Burgundy. In Jarras, they perfected the Solera system, aging sherry in stacked barrels exposed to temperature swings, which accelerated oxidation and created complex, nutty flavors. Valencia's winemakers buried clay tonnagers underground, using the Earth's stable temperature to control fermentation centuries before modern thermoregulation. Even surplus wine found purpose, distilled into brandy that could be stored indefinitely, liquid resilience in bottle form. The economic ripple effect was staggering. As Northern Europe's wine production plummeted, Spanish merchants filled the void. Basque ships laden with Rioja barrels became a common sight in Flemish ports, while sherry flowed through English ports duty-free under trade treaties. The influx of silver from Spain's New World colonies ironically boosted domestic wine sales, as returning conquistadors developed a taste for homegrown vintages over expensive French imports. By the mid-1600s, wine accounted for nearly a third of Spain's agricultural exports, a lifeline for a kingdom otherwise buckling under inflation and war debts. Yet the real legacy of Spain's wine boom wasn't economic, it was cultural. The Little Ice Age birthed enduring traditions, the lively vermouth bars of Barcelona, where herbs masked imperfect vintages, the rowdy harvest festivals of La Mancha, celebrating abundance in uncertain times. Even Don Quixote, penned during this era, immortalized wine's role in Spanish identity, his delusions fueled as much by cheap local vino as by chivalric romances. Today, as climate change again reshapes global wine maps, with English vineyards now producing sparkling wines rivaling champagne, and Scottish whiskey distilleries experimenting with heat-resistant barley, Spain's Little Ice Age lesson resonates. Adaptation isn't just about surviving change. It's about recognizing when your former weaknesses become newfound strengths. The same Tempranillo grapes that once needed Spain's harsh sun to ripen now thrive in cooler regions, while modern Priorat winemakers deliberately plant on steep, rocky slopes their ancestors would have dismissed. The takeaway: in the grand cellar of history, every climate shift leaves behind sediments of opportunity, if you're bold enough to taste what others might discard. When the first hard frost of 1522 crept across Scandinavia, it didn't just kill crops, it birthed legends. Farmers whispering around peat fires began describing towering figures with breath like blizzards and footsteps that left fields permanently frozen. These weren't mere campfire tales. They were psychological echoes of the Little Ice Age's relentless grip, etched into folklore as frost giants, embodiments of a climate gone merciless. Across the north, oral traditions swelled with similar imagery. Norse sagas spoke of the Fimbulwinter, a 3-year winter heralding the apocalypse, while Scottish ballads warned of the Cailleach, a blue-faced crone who kept spring captive in her icy staff. What makes these stories extraordinary isn't their supernatural elements, but their coded truth. The giants and witches were metaphors for very real disasters: failed harvests, frozen harbors, children lost in snowdrifts. In Iceland, the legend of Jökulrup told of glaciers vomiting floods when angered, mirroring actual glacial outbursts caused by volcanic activity under ice. German villagers recounted the Wild Hunt, a phantom army storming through winter skies, likely inspired by the eerie sounds of pack ice cracking on the Rhine. These narratives served a dual purpose, explaining the unexplainable while preserving survival knowledge across generations. A tale about a giant's curse might warn against planting crops too early. A witch's spell could encode the dangers of overhunting in lean years. The psychological function ran deeper still. Folklore became a coping mechanism for collective trauma. When reality offered no respite from cold, stories provided symbolic victories, heroes outwitting frost giants, clever maidens melting ice witches with kindness. In the Faroe Islands, where fishing was lifeblood, tales emerged of Selki's seal people offering storm warnings to kind humans. This wasn't whimsy. It reflected the very real practice of observing animal behavior for weather predictions. Even the recurring motif of the king who stole summer likely channeled resentment toward feudal lords who hoarded grain during famines. Modern climate researchers now mine these stories for data. The Greenlandic Inuit legend of Sela, a spirit whose displeasure brought storms, aligns with archaeological evidence of particularly brutal winters around 1600. Irish myths of cattle dying from elf shot and mysterious wounds match skeletal remains showing vitamin D deficiency from sunless years. The folklore's accuracy in some details is chilling. Basque whalers' tales of ice mountains moving south correspond perfectly with known glacier advances. Yet the most enduring lesson lies in how these stories bound communities together. Unlike written records kept by elites, folklore belonged to everyone, shared in peasant cottages and fishing boats, adapting with each telling to reflect new hardships. When a Shetland grandmother described the Nukkalevi, a skinless monster bringing plague, she wasn't just frightening children, she was reinforcing hygiene taboos during outbreaks. The stories wove resilience into cultural DNA, teaching that even the longest winter ends, and that humans, like the heroes of their tales, could outlast the cold through wit and cooperation. Today, as we face our own climate uncertainties, these ancient narratives resonate anew. They remind us that environmental upheaval isn't just measured in degrees or crop yields, it's lived through stories that shape how we endure. When modern authors craft dystopian tales of flooded cities or water wars, they're part of the same tradition as those medieval bards singing of frost giants. The medium changes, but the purpose remains, to make sense of the senseless and to whisper across centuries that survival is as much about the stories we tell as the actions we take. When the Thames froze solid in 1683, a curious man named Robert Hooke didn't just skate across it, he measured it. With a homemade thermometer and barometer strapped to his back, this London polymath became one of the first to systematically record the Little Ice Age's grip, scribbling data between frost-fair revelers. His notes, meticulously tracking temperature fluctuations and ice thickness, mark a pivotal shift, the moment when desperation birthed disciplined inquiry. Across Europe, similar scenes unfolded. Monks charting bloom dates in abbey gardens, Dutch engineers calibrating windmill efficiency in gale force winds, French vintners documenting failed vintages like forensic reports. What began as survival instinct was crystallizing into something revolutionary, the empirical study of climate itself. This wasn't academic curiosity, it was problem solving at civilization's brink. In Padua, Galileo's pupil Benedetto Caselli turned his telescope toward the clouds, developing early rain gauges to predict floods. His student Torricelli's mercury barometer, initially a laboratory novelty, soon found purpose in forecasting storms for Mediterranean fishermen. Even alchemy pivoted where once seekers chased philosophers' stones. They now distilled frost-resistant crop treatments from brine and herbs. The boundary between scholar and farmer blurred, with universities from Oxford to Krakow establishing agricultural chairs to formalize folk wisdom into testable theories. The breakthroughs often emerged from collaboration across unlikely divides. English diarist John Evelyn shared his notes on tree ring growth with Dutch lensmaker Antony van Leeuwenhoek, whose microscopes revealed how cold stunted cellular development. Their transdisciplinary dialogue anticipated modern dendroclimatology by centuries. Similarly, German miner Georg Agricola's studies of ore veins led him to document shifting water tables, an early grasp of hydrology born from mines flooding due to glacial melt. Perhaps the most profound legacy was the conceptual framework these pioneers built. When 17th century scientists like Edmund Halley mapped trade winds or Robert Boyle studied air pressure, they were assembling the building blocks of meteorology. The very term climate, derived from the Greek klima, meaning inclination of the sun, gained its modern meaning during this era, no longer just a geographic label, but a dynamic system to be measured and understood. Their tools were crude by today's standards: thermometers filled with brandy instead of mercury, rain collectors calibrated against wine barrels, but their methodology was startlingly modern. The Royal Society's directive to members in 1666 could serve as a research manifesto today. Observe diligently, record impartially, regard no tradition as sacred. This ethos transformed climate from divine caprice into a puzzle solvable through observation and ingenuity. The Little Ice Age's greatest gift to science may have been its duration. Unlike sudden disasters that inspire short-term fixes, its creeping timeline allowed theories to be tested across generations. When English naturalist John Ray noted in 1692 that migrating birds arrived later than in his grandfather's journals, he wasn't just lamenting, he was documenting phenological shift a century before the term existed. Such longitudinal studies became the scaffolding for later climate models. Today, when satellites track Arctic ice or algorithms predict El Niño patterns, they stand on the shoulders of those frostbitten pioneers. The connection is more than technological, it's philosophical. Our modern understanding that climate shapes history, that data can guide adaptation, that human ingenuity must confront environmental change, all these were forged in the crucible of Europe's Great Chill. The Little Ice Age didn't just test survival. It taught us how to think about survival, framing crises not as acts of fate but as challenges awaiting solutions. In that shift lies the birth of the scientific mind itself. While Scandinavian farmers watched their barley fields turn to ice and their cattle starve in frozen pastures, the Sami people were moving, always moving across a landscape that to outsiders seemed inhospitable. Their secret wasn't fighting the Little Ice Age's brutal winters, but embracing its rhythms through the one creature perfectly adapted to thrive in them, the reindeer. These semi-nomadic herders had honed a symbiotic relationship with their herds over centuries, a partnership that became Scandinavia's most elegant survival strategy when temperatures plummeted. Where settled agriculture faltered, the Sami's mobility and deep ecological knowledge created resilience in the face of climatic chaos. Reindeer were more than livestock to the Sami, they were four-legged survival kits. Their hooves splayed wide to walk on snow without sinking, their noses specially adapted to warm Arctic air before it reached their lungs, and their digestive systems could extract nutrients from over 50 species of lichen that nothing else could digest. As the Little Ice Age intensified, these traits became invaluable. While European farmers struggled to grow fodder, reindeer foraged freely. their migrations uncovering buried lichen beneath the snow. A single herd could provide meat, milk, and hides for clothing, while their sinews became thread and their antlers tools. Even their blood, rich in iron and vitamin C, was consumed to prevent scurvy during sunless winters. This wasn't just animal husbandry, it was a masterclass in resource efficiency. The Sami's seasonal migrations, known as transhumance, turned environmental challenges into advantages. Each spring, they guided herds to coastal pastures where salty grasses provided essential minerals. Summer saw them move inland to lush mountain plateaus, avoiding the swarms of mosquitoes that could literally drain a reindeer of blood. Come autumn, they retreated to sheltered pine forests where tree lichen hung like natural granaries. When the Little Ice Age shortened summers and extended winters, the Sami simply adjusted their routes, sometimes covering over 1,000 miles annually. Their lavu tents, designed with a central smoke hole and insulating double walls, could be dismantled and rebuilt in hours, making them far more adaptable than any farmer's cottage. What set the Sami apart wasn't just their techniques, but their philosophy. Unlike European farmers who saw land as something to claim and control, the Sami viewed themselves as participants in a shared ecosystem. Their joik songs, each melody uniquely tied to a person, animal, or landscape feature, encoded generations of ecological knowledge, which valleys offered shelter from blizzards, which lakes froze latest. This oral tradition functioned as a living database of survival strategies, constantly updated and shared. When Danish authorities tried to impose fixed grazing boundaries during the coldest years, the Sami resisted, knowing that rigidity meant death in a changing climate. The contrast with Scandinavian farmers was stark. While villagers huddled around meager fires praying for spring, Sami children learned to identify edible mosses and predict storms by the behavior of reindeer. Where grain stores failed, Sami women preserved meat in hollowed-out tree trunks packed with snow, creating natural freezers. Their reversible fur garments, sewn with sinew thread that expanded when wet to prevent tearing, outperformed woolen European clothing in blizzard conditions. Even their sleds, curved at both ends to navigate deep snow, became coveted trade items. Frozen rivers that crippled wheeled transport were highways for Sami sleds. Modern science now confirms the brilliance of these adaptations. Studies of reindeer bones from Little Ice Age sites show stable isotope signatures indicating diverse, nutrient-rich diets despite the cooling climate. Linguistic analysis reveals how Sami language evolved specific terms for subtle snow variations, crucial knowledge when determining grazing routes. Even their social structure fostered resilience. Decision-making was distributed among family groups, allowing rapid adaptation without centralized authority, a lesson in decentralized crisis management. The Sami's legacy whispers a truth we're only now relearning. That survival in a changing world isn't about dominating nature, but dancing with it. While Europe's kings built granaries that emptied and churches that couldn't stop the cold, the Sami's humble sled tracks traced a different path, one of flexibility, reciprocity, and quiet observation. Their story isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a beacon for our own era of climate uncertainty, proving that sometimes the most advanced technology is wisdom passed down through generations, wrapped in reindeer hide and sung into the wind. From frozen rivers to reinvented economies, medieval Europeans faced the Little Ice Age with creativity and grit. Their stories remind us that climate challenges are not new, but neither is human resilience. As we confront our own environmental uncertainties, these lessons from the past urge us to adapt, innovate, and above all, endure. Consider the sheer scope of what they overcame. For nearly 500 years, entire generations lived under skies that refused to warm, watching glaciers swallow their villages and frost claim their harvests. Yet they didn't just survive, they reimagined their world. Farmers became fishermen, windmills became water pumps, and even beer recipes transformed to match a colder earth. Every solution, from the Baltic rye trade to Alpine cheese caves, carried the same message: when the old ways fail, we find new ones. What's striking isn't just their ingenuity, it's their refusal to see themselves as victims. The Dutch didn't curse their sinking peatlands, they engineered pumps to reclaim them. The Sami didn't abandon reindeer herding when winters grew harsher, they deepened their partnership with the herds. Even in Greenland, where Norse settlers ultimately faltered, their story holds a warning about the cost of inflexibility, a reminder that adaptation isn't betrayal of tradition, but its evolution. These medieval survivors left us more than just tools and techniques. They bequeathed a mindset. When the Thames froze, Londoners held frost fairs on the ice. When vineyards failed, Spanish winemakers perfected sherry. Their resilience wasn't just practical, it was cultural, woven into songs, art, and even the way they rebuilt their homes. They understood what we're relearning today, that climate upheaval demands not just technological fixes, but shifts in how we live, trade, and care for one another. As we face rising seas and shifting weather patterns, their legacy offers both comfort and challenge. Comfort, because their struggles prove that humanity has weathered drastic change before. Challenge, because their successes came from collective action: waterboards governing Dutch dikes, Hanseatic merchants sharing risks, villages pooling grain stores. No one survived alone, so let's turn the final question to you. Which of these survival stories speaks to our moment? Is it the windmill engineers proving that green technology isn't a modern invention? The Cluny monks showing how data can guide us through uncertainty? Or perhaps the Sami reminding us that sometimes the wisest path isn't resisting change, but moving with it? Drop your thoughts below, and if you've enjoyed this journey through history's icy crucible, hit subscribe. Because the past isn't just a record, it's a compass pointing the way through storms still to come.